Right now, a container ship rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope takes, well, 40% longer to deliver its goods.
Yeah, at least 40%. It's a massive logistical nightmare.
Right, and we are told this geopolitical chaos in the Middle East is the exact reason your grocery bill is skyrocketing. But I am arguing that this war is just a convenient smokescreen for a mathematical bug in our global economy that was, frankly, programmed years ago.
A smokescreen? I mean, we're looking at a world where 1/5 of the global energy supply is violently choked off.
We are currently witnessing the mathematical and physical stagnation of the existing linear capitalist operating system. That is a model defined entirely by external extraction, ownership, and relentless accumulation.
Okay, but you are completely dismissing the human and economic reality of an unpredictable geopolitical tragedy just to fit this theoretical model of yours.
The dominant narrative points to the physical blockage of the Strait of Hormuz, right? It temporarily cut off 20% of energy supplies and spiked oil to $120 a barrel. The public is being told this external conflict is the root cause of global inflation.
Because it is. That is a very real, very hot war.
It is not the root cause. This conflict is a highly engineered storytelling device. It is masking a structural collapse that was guaranteed the exact moment central banks flooded the system with early 2020s quantitative easing.
Look, I represent the perspective of market mechanics and basic reality here. You cannot look at a sudden violent disruption in global supply chains and call it a storytelling device. It is directly driving up the cost of everyday goods through sheer logistical friction. Consumers are not victims of some mathematical bug.
The physical data dictates otherwise. The transition to circular capitalism is the only viable reality left. Inflation, from a strict resource perspective, is an energy leak.
An energy leak?
Yes. It is the result of linear resource consumption hitting its absolute physical limit. Central banks have paraded their 2% inflation targets for decades, but, those targets were always theoretical illusions.
They were based on historical macroeconomic stability.
They were built on the assumption of infinite cheap physical resources. They completely ignored the thermodynamic constraints of the planet. Let me clarify the actual mechanism at play here. Think of the global economy as a restaurant, okay?
Okay, a restaurant.
And the central bank is the chef. During quantitative easing, central banks created trillions of dollars out of thin air to buy bonds. They flooded the system with paper demand while the physical supply remained totally static.
Well, they were preventing a total deflationary collapse at the time.
Regardless of intent, the chef has had the frying pan red hot for 5 straight years, pumping an artificial financial heat. The steak in the pan was already burning black.
Right.
That is the chronic structural inflation baked into our linear supply chain long before any war broke out. But suddenly a fire breaks out in the building next door, the Middle East conflict.
Which is a massive fire.
Yes, and the chef points out the window and screams, "This steak is burning because of the heat from the fire next door. I have no responsibility."
But the flames next door are real. They are literally licking the walls of the restaurant. You are acting as if the war has no physical consequence, which just ignores the basic mechanics of global trade.
The physical consequence is secondary to the existing structural failure.
I disagree. Look at the physical reality of the global shipping industry right now. Because of the conflict, that Cape of Good Hope detour you mentioned has become mandatory for thousands of vessels. That detour mathematically increases shipping distances by 40%.
I am aware of the distance.
A 40% increase in distance means, a 40% increase in bunker fuel consumption per voyage. It means longer periods holding insurance liabilities, extended crew wages. It reduces the total availability of shipping containers because they're stuck on the water for an extra 3 weeks.
And you think this is the primary driver of the cost of living crisis?
It unequivocally proves that the inflation we are feeling at the grocery store is a supply-side constraint caused by external enemies and geopolitical chaos. It is not an internal systemic bug. And honestly, despite this massive friction, people are proving incredibly resilient.
Resilient?
Yes. They are making substitutions, they're shifting their household budgets around, and they're just getting used to the new baseline.
The customers are not getting used to it. You are mistaking high-cost forced compliance for adaptation.
I wouldn't call it forced compliance. They are surviving a crisis.
They are trapped in an uncancelable survival subscription where the membership fee keeps rising arbitrarily. Let's actually examine the mechanics of those household budgets you brought up.
Sure.
In the early stages of this inflation, people were angry. Now, because getting angry requires too much caloric and emotional energy, citizens are structurally forced into a low-fuel mood.
That's a bit of an exaggeration, don't you think?
It is not. They are unconsciously cutting their expenditures just to maintain the absolute bare minimum required to exist. It is the boiling frog phenomenon in real time. They are convincing themselves that this water temperature is normal.
But they are adapting to the price of food.
Look at the supply chain of a single calorie of food. The modern agricultural system is a fossil fuel predator. To grow the wheat for a loaf of bread, you must pull nitrogen from the air using the Haber-Bosch process, right?
Yes, industrial fertilizer.
And that requires immense heat and pressure generated almost entirely by natural gas. Fertilizer is essentially solid natural gas. When the cost of that external energy input skyrockets, food price inflation is not a simple logistical markup or a temporary shipping delay.
Well, it's heavily influenced by the shipping.
It is the physical manifestation of an external dependent model fundamentally breaking down at the chemical level.
Okay, even acknowledging the heavy energy dependence of modern agriculture, you cannot write off the entire global economic system as fundamentally collapsed. We are looking at a severe, yes, but temporary downturn.
There is nothing temporary about a structural thermodynamic failure.
Take Europe, for example. Europe is weathering a historically tough business cycle right now. But major economies have deep institutional buffers, strategic reserves, and dynamic pricing mechanisms that naturally incentivize alternatives.
Those buffers are paper.
No, they are real policy tools. Once the geopolitical conflict subsides and the shipping lanes reopen, which historically they always do, the supply constraints will ease. Europe will recover its industrial output. They just have to hold the line and manage the monetary policy until the external shock passes.
The physical data from Europe proves your economic models are entirely divorced from physical reality.
How so?
Germany's factory orders plummeted over 11% by March 2026. Their industrial production has plunged into deep negative territory. In the UK, 10-year government bonds hit an 18-year high of 5.1%.
Interest rates are high to fight the inflation. That's standard policy.
Capital is fleeing because the systemic maintenance cost of the UK now mathematically exceeds its economic output capacity. Europe's entire economic structure is a purely linear model. They import cheap external energy, process it into high-value goods, and export it. That model is now completely necrotic.
Necrotic is a very strong word for a recession.
Consider the mechanism of deindustrialization. Europe, and particularly Germany, is a bodybuilder. And this bodybuilder relied entirely on massive daily doses of cheap protein, meaning Middle Eastern and Russian energy, to build unnatural, heavy industry muscles.
Okay, the external protein is cut off, but they can pivot.
They possess no internal ability to synthesize resources. They lack circular infrastructure. To maintain baseline bodily functions, the bodybuilder is physically forced to break down their own muscle mass just to generate energy.
You're talking about the factory closures.
Yes.
That muscle breakdown is the permanent closure of chemical plants and steel mills. Meanwhile, a small farmer relying on a local circular economy is far healthier because they are not tethered to a collapsing external supply line.
Wait, Europe is actively pivoting to address exactly that vulnerability. You can't say they lack the capacity for internal synthesis when we are looking right at the upcoming May 2026 EU waste regulations.
Regulations on paper is not just a minor policy adjustment. It is a massive, continent-wide legislative shift toward a circular economy. It mandates strict extended producer responsibility. Companies are now legally required to physically design products for disassembly and material recovery.
A legal requirement does not manifest energy.
The EU is heavily subsidizing local biorefineries to turn agricultural waste into industrial feedstocks. This proves that the system is highly capable of a managed transition. They are internalizing the costs of their supply chains.
They are legislating fantasy.
They are building the exact internal synthesis you claim they lack. It's a grueling adjustment phase, absolutely, but it is not a death sentence for the economy.
A regulatory mandate written on paper does not retroactively generate physical infrastructure, nor does it alter the laws of thermodynamics. The May 2026 regulations are arriving far too late.
They are forcing the transition right now.
Recycling a wind turbine blade or recovering lithium from a degraded battery requires massive energy inputs. If the baseline cost of energy is already mathematically unaffordable because the external supply lines are structurally broken, mandating recycling simply forces companies to perform highly energy-intensive processes at a severe financial loss.
It's an investment in future stability.
It is a grueling physical rehabilitation prescribed for a body that is already experiencing multi-organ failure. When your industrial base is shutting down permanently because the physical input costs exceed the market value of the output, a new waste recycling mandate simply adds an insurmountable compliance cost to an already suffocating economy.
But the markets don't agree with you.
It is not a managed transition, it is a legislative acceleration of the necrosis.
Look, if physical collapse is truly inevitable right now, the global markets are entirely failing to price it in. How do you explain the market projections from major financial institutions?
I don't trust them.
Well, Goldman Sachs is projecting that oil might drop to the $50 range by late 2026. That is the empirical light at the end of the tunnel. It proves that the wait-and-see approach adopted by governments and central banks is actually working.
It proves nothing of the sort.
Forward markets are pricing in a resolution to the conflict. They expect supply and demand to settle at a lower equilibrium. If your theory of irreversible structural collapse were true, prices would simply climb to infinity as resources vanished. The projected drop in oil prices shows the global pricing mechanism doing exactly what it was designed to do, naturally rebalancing the system.
You are biting into a toxic apple by trusting those projections as indicators of systemic health.
Why? It's data.
WTI and Brent crude may momentarily hover around $90 to $100, sure. But Middle East Dubai crude is currently breaching the $150 tail risk barrier. That discrepancy exposes the physical fracture between regions that control logistical choke points and those that do not.
Regional pricing disparities are normal during a war.
Furthermore, you are fundamentally misinterpreting the mechanism of a price drop. If global oil prices drop to $50, it is not due to a recovery or a market rebalancing. It is because global manufacturing has permanently halted and consumer purchasing power is physically dead.
You're saying the demand is just gone.
Exactly. The global economy is a roller coaster where all the passengers are on the verge of fainting from the extreme G-forces of inflation. Someone standing safely on the ground points up at the dropping altitude of the cars and says, "Look, the altitude, the oil price is dropping. We are safe."
But a drop in price provides relief to the consumer.
In reality, the wheels have sheared off the track and the coaster is in terminal freefall. A price drop driven by total industrial demand destruction is not a market-finding equilibrium. It is the terminal phase of the system's necrosis.
Look, the wait-and-see approach, this static mode that governments are maintaining, is the only responsible action during active geopolitical crisis.
Responsible?
Yes. If governments panic and attempt to completely dismantle and rebuild the economic system while an active war is choking off energy, it would cause immediate global chaos. By maintaining stability, projecting calm, and using monetary policy to manage the inflation narrative, they're preventing mass panic. They're keeping the ship afloat while diplomacy and military strategy resolve the external shock.
They are ensuring the ship sinks.
How? They are buying time.
It is like the captain of a sinking luxury liner telling the passengers, "We are fighting with the ship next door, so let's forget about fixing the massive hole in our hull. Instead, we'll screen a great war movie for you."
That's incredibly cynical.
The passengers sit quietly in the rising water, completely distracted by the geopolitical spectacle on the screen, permanently losing their only window of time to repair the physical damage to the ship.
Governments are actively working on solutions.
Wait and see is the deliberate avoidance of allocating capital to build resource circular infrastructure. By the time the movie ends, the water will be over their heads.
Okay, well, if the water was truly over our heads, if the system was fundamentally failing to sustain human life, as you claim, there would be global riots right now.
No.
Yes, people would be physically tearing the system down in the streets, but they aren't. People are enduring. Yes, we see labor actions like the Lufthansa pilots in Germany back in mid-March, or the massive teacher strikes in Australia, but those are organized, isolated labor disputes over wage adjustments.
They are not isolated.
They are using established mechanisms to negotiate better terms within the existing system. They are not a systemic, global revolt against the capitalist operating system itself. The social fabric is holding together, which proves the market economy is far more resilient than your rigid thermodynamic calculations account for.
The public is entirely drained of the biological energy required to revolt.
Biological energy?
Yes. The global economy is a restaurant where the menu price goes up every 5 minutes. Let's look at the mechanism of systemic exhaustion. First, the customer gives up the meat because the protein is too expensive.
Right, dietary shifts.
Then, they give up the salad because the logistical markup on fresh produce is unaffordable. Finally, they just sit there, surviving on the smell of the bread.
People are still consuming.
Barely. Management looks out at the silent dining room and arrogantly claims, "The customers are used to the new prices and tolerating it well. There are no riots." In reality, the customers have no calories left to even stand up and leave the building.
That is an extreme metaphor.
They are paralyzed by the sheer cost of existing. Soon they will be charged just to breathe the air inside the restaurant. The strikes in Germany and Australia are not isolated wage negotiations. They are the early physical breakdown of the baseline social contract. The digital painkillers, credit card extensions, algorithmic entertainment, they are wearing off.
Let's analyze this purely mechanically then, even cynically from the perspective of the state. Even if it is a grinding, painful period for the consumer, hasn't the government successfully utilized this inflation crisis to reset their massive ledgers?
Go on.
Coming out of the pandemic, G7 debt-to-GDP ratios were at catastrophic levels, anywhere from 120% to 260%. Let's look at the math. Inflation is a hidden tax.
Correct.
If inflation halves the purchasing power of the currency over a decade, the government is effectively paying back its massive sovereign debts with 50 cents on the dollar. Through this sustained, elevated inflation, governments are effectively erasing the public debt.
They're defaulting in slow motion.
They are deflating away obligations that could never realistically be paid back through taxation. In a very cold, mathematical sense, they have engineered a successful debt jubilee. They have saved the sovereign balance sheet and avoided a formal default that would have crashed the global banking system.
You have correctly identified the mechanics of this so-called debt jubilee, but you are entirely wrong to categorize it as a successful save.
How is it not a save? The debt is shrinking in real terms.
It is a fraudulent transfer of wealth that physically hollows out the society it claims to govern. Let's use another analogy. A casino manager runs his business into massive, unpayable debt. He intentionally incites a riot on the casino floor, secretly empties the cash register, and burns all the IOUs he owes to the customers.
The state isn't intentionally inciting a riot.
The next day, he stands in the wreckage and tells the customers, "Because of yesterday's riot, your chips are only worth half. But at least the shop isn't broken, right?" The culprit is that rioting customer, the external enemy.
This ignores the macro necessity of managing debt.
Or similarly, a man with massive gambling debts throws Molotov cocktails at his own house and screams to the crowd, "My house burned down because of the mob! All my IOUs burned! I am the victim!"
Okay, but
The crowd looks on in pity, saying, "Oh no, his house burning is the mob's fault." The sovereign debt on paper is gone, yes, but the physical value, the purchasing power, and the accumulated labor of the citizenry has been incinerated.
Look, the erasure of purchasing power is a severe consequence, yes. But market economies have endured massive inflationary cycles and wealth destruction before, from the 1970s oil shocks to post-war reconstructions. And in every single instance, the pricing mechanism eventually incentivizes new production methods, new energy sources, and technological breakthroughs.
Those eras had fresh, unexploited resource pools to tap into. We do not.
The linear model you describe isn't some rigid, unchangeable machine. It is a dynamic network of human innovation. Yes, the transition away from cheap Middle Eastern energy is painful, and the immediate physical constraints on fertilizer and shipping are causing immense friction.
Friction is an understatement.
But treating this specific geopolitical crisis as the permanent mathematical death of global capitalism severely underestimates the historical resiliency of free markets to price in scarcity and adapt. The debt may be inflated away, but the physical infrastructure and the human capital to rebuild the supply chains remain intact. The market will provide a solution. Well, you can't just discount human innovation.
The era of linear capitalism, stealing external resources, processing them inefficiently, and pushing the physical and financial debt onto future generations is physically dead.
But the human capital...
The paper debt of the sovereign states may be temporarily erased in the ashes of this engineered inflation, but their physical infrastructure is empty. You cannot run a factory on erased public debt.
All right.
Well, I don't have an answer to empty shipping containers, but
If the raw material inputs and the energy aren't there, no amount of fiscal maneuvering or market pricing changes the thermodynamic reality of an empty shipping container. The collapse of the existing system is irreversible. The transition to circular capitalism, where resource synthesis, material recovery, and energy retention happen internally, is not a moral preference. It is not an environmental slogan. It is the absolute and only rational investment left for human survival. The menu prices will continue to rise until the restaurant burns down completely. The only question that remains is whether you will keep paying the subscription fee for a sinking ship, or if you will finally step off the roller coaster before it hits the ground.